Hello. I've been thinking and not struggling over the idea of it, right, but thinking on the idea of religion, right, and the history that we have in this country with religion, most notably Christianity, right? And I've had a little few exchanges with people, but not like long, meaningful conversations, right? And I don't believe that my mind or that I'm there to. There'll never be a time where I'll convert to Christianity or I'll go back to being a Catholic. I never really was one, right? And I always had questions around that. Not to pick holes in it and just disregard it, right? But just questions. Because luckily enough, in my childhood, I was exposed to and introduced to Irish mythology, and the stories they always coloured my mind a little bit more than religious studies in school or religion class in school. And I was always naturally more drawn to them, right? And as I got older, I started to see some of the lessons that can be learned from Irish mythology and folklore and the stories that survived thousands of years. We don't know how long, right? Thousands of years at least in this country. And while stories aren't real, right, they're reflective of the mind that created them. So if you have characters acting in virtuous ways in the stories continuously, right, and nefarious ways, you're getting a mirror image of the values and the morality that those who created and shared and handed down the stories also held. Otherwise, the stories would mean absolutely nothing to them and they disregard them as meaningless, right? But they weren't meaningless to our people, right? Because they were handed down and they were taken care of sufficiently enough to be able, in this day and age, to go back and read stories that could be, they're at least 2,000 years old, but they could be as many as 30,000 years old, because there's been people in Ireland for that, in that window, right, for at least 30,000, 33,000 years or whatever funny number, right? But people have been in Ireland for at least 30,000 years, okay? So if there's people there, you would assume that there's talking there, and if there's talking and communication there, you would assume stories, right? So these things have been cooking and being refined through the ages and morphing through the ages depending on the sensibilities of the people at the time, right? Different parts are amplified, different parts shrink into the background to be resuscitated again in different ages, right? Depending on the people. Stories will shift. So the dating of the stories is not really that interesting, right? Or not really that important to me. What is important to me is the lens that I can see my ancestors through by reading the stories that they took the care enough to hand down and to assure the survival of these stories in the worst sorts of circumstances that we've endured in this country. We retained our stories for long enough, as I said, for us to be able to read them today. And then we get to Christianity. And I can understand the draw of people wanting to return to something more stable than the ages that we're living in now. And I don't even mean to be too heavy or hard on Christianity. I just fundamentally disagree with it in terms of the philosophy that's baked into it. I wholeheartedly disagree with it. I don't believe that we should be honouring, or I believe that our society will be a little bit more self-respecting, a little bit more fruitful, if our attention was not predominantly aimed at something that is transcendent to us, something that is external to us, right? That's the Christian way. The pre-Christian Irish way, the onus and the emphasis and the attention was on life itself. Not the creator, but the very creation. And I would pause on even assuming that the old Irish perspective assumed that, instead of seeing life as the very creating force of itself, right? The manifesting of itself. It's kind of self-creating God or power than Nyart, right? Whatever way you want to frame it. And for myself then, the desire to return to a Christian belief, I think I understand it, right? But for me, I've always, not always, right? I haven't always, in and out, right? In and out. But over the last few years, certainly the last, what age? We say 10 years, right? You get older and you forget what age you are. You have to count the numbers, right? But over the last 10 years particularly, my faith has been in my people, in the Irish people. And strangely enough, right, I am absolutely not a social person. I'm not the most engaging in terms of conversation with people. I'm not the friendliest of people, right? But my faith nonetheless is in the Irish people, because I understand a little of our history, and I understand the beauty that can come out of us in the stories that we articulated and handed down, right? I put it this way, even though these stories, the Irish myths, right, and whatever you want to call them, could be tens of thousands of years, but most certainly at least 2,000 years old, right? Even though they're thousands of years older than what we have now, the image that of society that is painted and articulated and conveyed in these stories, to me, is a far more worthwhile society than what we have at the moment. And even I would go so far as to say, my own opinion, it was a far more worthwhile and meaningful existence and society than what Catholicism ever offered to us. And so for myself, my faith is in my people, because I've seen and read what they have created prior to a different worldview. And the Irish version of their own history and their own people and their own expressing of their morality and their psychology, their soul and spirit at the time, that to me is far more appealing than anything we have ever accepted in the succeeding generations and years after that. And so my faith will never be dissuaded from that. The Irish genius, the Irish penchant for society. And that doesn't mean dragging, kicking and screaming us back into that time, or trying to kind of LARP or resuscitate and directly replicate what came before. No, it means that there's far more value for myself. I have found far more value in exploring the thinking of Irish people than I have in exploring what the Irish mind, how it grappled with Christianity and Catholicism. Interesting in and of itself, right? And beneficial in ways in and of itself. But for me, I would rather live trying to understand my people's thinking from the pre-Christian times than to just revert back to something that I don't believe has been truly beneficial for us long scale.